So because you are, in all likelihood, in a normal crime scene situation, you are the first person or one of the first people to enter that scene. The idea is to show a representation, as we've talked about in lecture, that it is supposed to be an accurate representation of what that scene looked like when you arrived. So you don't want to be creating any additional or adding any additional artifacts or making any changes without some type of context photo, or at least referencing that in your notes as to what has been altered or changed, that maybe the photograph appears to look different than what your notations or your written descriptors are. So when you are doing your photographs, you want to make sure that there are no people that are walking about within the crime scene. If you've got partners or there's other investigators present, the victim and so forth, no one should be in that photograph. You're taking photographs of the scene, not the occupants that are in the scene. Likewise, when you're bringing equipment in, whether you're bringing light systems, photography equipment, bringing in fingerprinting supplies, or any other equipment you might be bringing into the scene, those should not be made visible within the photographs as well. Because you have to remember that anything that you bring, anything that appears in the photo is now going to be subject to scrutiny when it comes to the court proceedings. And you want to maintain integrity, you want to maintain professionalism, so anything that you do that potentially compromises the integrity of the scene is obviously going to be shown in those photos. Likewise, when you're in that scene, you mentioned about altering it, you don't want to be altering it. Obviously, whatever it is that you're processing in the scene, there is a destructive or a degradation that's associated with it, which is understandable as you're systematically going through and examining the scene. An example for that would be, suppose you had a sexual assault, for instance, that occurred in a bed. You've got multiple layers of bedding that are on that bed. You can't photograph in between the layers of the sheets with one photograph. So you have to photograph it, remove the layer, package that layer, take the photograph the next layer, and package that one, and so forth. So peeling layers back as you're going through the scene, potentially revealing additional evidence as you're going through. In that same vein, as far as not altering the scene, you certainly don't want to be eating anything or drinking anything. You want to make sure that, depending on what the nature of the scene, you maybe want to consider what type of personal protective equipment is going to be required, not only to maintain your own personal safety, but also, again, the integrity of the scene. So some of the considerations that you might want to think about while you're setting up your scene and processing it is that you're again taking into consideration the depth of field. So, you know, as we've talked about in lecture and in our previous practicals, if you're trying to do a larger area, you want, generally speaking, you want as much to be in focus or in acceptable focus as possible. And a crime scene is no different. So for general crime scene photography, generally you're going to want to stop down to a smaller aperture, which is going to increase your depth of field, so more of that scene is going to be in focus. Certainly when you're doing close-up photography of your specific items, either macro or close-up, then you're going to find maybe altering that to not to become a distractor as far as the background goes, the focus being on the subject that you're actually photographing. A couple of other things to consider is the lighting. Now, many of you are going to be doing this at home or in some remote area. So the opportunity to use flash, again, if you're stopping down to a small aperture, you're going to, in all likelihood, have to increase the amount of light or provide some type of an auxiliary lighting source. I would suggest, if you can't illuminate it either by natural light coming in a window or by overhead lighting, and you need to increase it with either a flashlight or using your camera, using an auxiliary lighting source from the camera, I do not want you using the on-camera flash capability. If you are requiring to use a flash, or that is the option you're choosing to use a flash, I want you to use your off-camera flash with the speed light and optionally whether you use the sync cord or not. Bearing in mind when you're taking your photos, you have to think about where that light is being projected from. If the external flash is mounted on the hot shoe of the camera, it is not necessarily going to illuminate that area as efficiently or effectively as you want. Think about where natural light comes from. You know, we get our light sources from the sun, artificial lighting in a room, we've got ceiling lighting. Get that flash unit up high and angle it down slightly so now that light is cascading from above, and it's going to give you a much wider area of illumination and a more natural lighting scenario. So for this exercise, you're going to be operating your camera in full manual mode. So again, bearing in mind your reciprocal agreements between aperture and shutter speed, you can also utilize the light meter that's inside the viewing window to give you an approximation of what is considered to be a properly illuminated or exposed image for your photography.